The Xtalks Life Science Podcast is your source for all things pharma, biotech, medtech, healthcare, research, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com, and this week I am happy to introduce our very special guest on the show today. With us, we have Jason Matuszewski, who is the Chairman, CEO, and co-founder of BioStem Technologies, a company focused on harnessing the natural properties of perinatal tissue in the development, manufacture, and commercialization of allografts for regenerative therapies, leveraging a proprietary processing method. After starting his career as a technical engineer at SC Johnson and later leading process and quality initiatives at companies like ATI Ladish Forging, Nemak and HUSCO International, Jason's work with the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation inspired his move into biotech. At BioStem, Jason has overseen the optimization of tissue sourcing, the build out of a 6,000 square foot fully FDA and AATB-compliant tissue processing facility, and the growth of a high-performing team. Jason has a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering Technology, is a Six Sigma Black Belt, and serves on the AATB Processing and Distribution Council and BioFlorida's Government Affairs Committee. To learn more about the work that Jason is heading in the regenerative medicine space at BioStem, let's turn to him now. Thank you so much for being on the show with us today, Jason.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to start off by first asking you a bit more about BioStem Technologies and what inspired its founding, as you are a co-founder of the company, and also what core mission drives the company's work in the regenerative medicine space.
So BioStem Technologies is a medtech company focused on the advancement of regenerative medicine for advanced wound care. So we harness the natural properties of placental tissue for specifically chronic or hard to heal wounds, things like diabetic foot ulcers, pressure ulcers, and venous leg ulcers, as well as acute wounds, so surgical wounds or trauma wounds. We developed a proprietary technology called BioRetain, which differentiates our processing method for our products. Talk a little bit about what inspired us on the founding side, my co-founding partner's father had a rare brain tumor, went to the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, received an experimental treatment, and was left with stroke-like symptoms across half his body. And he sought a treatment to regain some of those functions back. And the original foundation of this company was focused on regenerative medicine ex-US before we got into the BioRetain technology. He received a therapy from this company before we took it over or purchased it, and started regaining a lot of those functions back. And so we got really excited about what are the possible uses outside of the therapy that he received with regenerative medicine. And so we took on the endeavor of purchasing the entity and really kind of developing it to where it is today.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that personal story of one of your co-founders. And definitely when you have stories like that behind any kind of an initiative, I think it really just lays a very strong foundation, definitely. And you mentioned BioStem's proprietary product, which is BioRetain, the processing method, And so could you tell us a bit more about it? What makes it unique and compared to conventional allograft preparation techniques?
Yeah, so what we looked at is kind of twofold. One, how do we optimize the process? So how do we make it more efficient in manufacturing specifically perinatal tissue? What we originally were struggling with is that it took us a very long time to process this tissue under one hood, and we only had a very small footprint, as you alluded to in the intro, just about 6,000 square feet. And so we looked at, okay, how do we go from 10 hours of processing time to 8 to 6 to 4? And we worked and iterated on methods and uses of when we collect the material, what materials we should be using, when we receive the material at our facility, what materials we should be using as we actually process it within the biosafety cabinet. And all those iterative steps actually improved the efficiency in manufacturing and actually got our processing time from roughly about 10 hours down to about anywhere between 5 to 6 hours. What we didn't know is that by doing those iterative steps, we actually created a better product. And so we didn't find that out until we started delivering product to patients. And they noticed that when they were using a competitor-based product, the healing time was a lot slower. And when they used our product, they started seeing recovery times a lot quicker. And so we said, wow, maybe we actually created something differentiated here. And so we challenged our R&D and scientific team to really kind of look at what is the differentiation between the conventional way you could process placental-based tissue allografts and our method. I like to use an analogy. You can build a sandwich two ways, right? Meaning the bread of the sandwich being the ends of the sandwich or the cover or structure of the sandwich. You can use either white, very bleached floured bread, very high processed bread, or you can use organic natural bread, right? And so how we look at our tissue is more of the organic natural bread, where we retain all the natural properties of tissue, of placental-based tissue in that allograft, the structure, the growth factors, and some of the proteins and cytokines and things of that nature that are natural to this tissue. Whereas competitors or peers tend to strip a lot of those natural elements out and also denature the structural components of that tissue. So it's an easy kind of way to think about what is the differentiation building a sandwich versus our allografts.
I love that analogy, really, and it also speaks to the name. It's bio-retain, kind of retaining the biological organic properties of the tissue, much like whole wheat or brown bread versus white bread. So that's a fantastic analogy. I love that.
I actually, in our office, when you walk into our office, there's 3 pictures. It's white, denatured bread, our allograft, and organic natural bread. So.
I love that. That is so great, because I think often being in the science space, I think we often get lost in the technicalities in the world of science and all the details. And so when you're trying to explain concepts to the layperson or to people outside in other fields, I think to have really potent and engaging and clear messaging with analogies, I think it's fantastic. Yeah. Communication is key. So I love that. Yeah. And so in creating a method like BioRetain and really retaining the natural properties of the tissue, what are some of the scientific or technical challenges that your team had to overcome to optimize the process? And I know you mentioned that you posed this as a challenge to your team. And so what were some of the things that you all ran into, and how did you overcome some of the considerations and challenges at play?
Yeah, I think originally, as I alluded to earlier about the challenge of time, right? Our facility is very small, so we were looking at how do we increase our output so that we can be a successful commercialization business unit to be successful and be able to generate positive EBITDA and profitability in a very small footprint. And so to do that, you had to get more efficient on the process. And be able to manufacture as many units out of our small footprint. So that was really, call it one of the bigger drivers. I think some of the other challenges, as I kind of talked about iterations at certain time points, looking at ways our team can look at, for example, storage media when the product is collected at collection sites and transported to our facility. What are the medias we should be using, and how does that impact the product at the end result, right? Different techniques on drying or dehydrating the material, right? Is there different methods in which we can do to meet our endpoint goal of increasing efficiency at the same time retaining all those natural properties, right? Looking at sterilization methods, is there certain methods in which we should sterilize the product to meet sterility requirements, but also not impact the product so much that it loses those natural factors of retained elements, right? And so there was kind of bits of the process that we looked at and challenged the team on how to improve those incremental processes. It took us probably close to 1.5 to 2 years to kind of go through that process of identifying where there are process improvements, doing some scientific analysis, coming up with the end result of what each bit is, and then combining all those to create an amazing end product.
And in terms of when we talk about different therapeutic areas, conditions, what areas are you looking currently to target and are testing this method in? And I know that you're also engaged in clinical trials and clinical testing of this method. And so could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So currently, we just published our preliminary data around diabetic foot ulcers, the use of our product for treating diabetic foot ulcers. We're really excited about the outcomes there. Our preliminary results indicated that basically a 2 times greater effect on treating patients versus the standard of care. We're currently enrolling patients in a venous leg ulcer study, a VLU study, and we're continuing to look at real world data around pressure ulcers and how the product impacts those patients by utilizing our product on those patients. So we're continuing to invest in clinical data. The goal, obviously, is to demonstrate the superiority of BioRetain, but then also look at communicating to coverage policy folks to demonstrate why there should be coverage and adoption of these products, whether it be Medicare, Medicaid, commercial payer plans, things of that nature, to advocate for using our proprietary products versus standard of care or other methods to treat chronic wounds.
Yeah, and you mentioned coverage, whether through things like Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance payers, and so and tying into the regulatory end of things. So how has the regulatory kind of journey been so far? And I know I'm not sure if you're quite there yet, but what are some of the learnings and really that apply, and how are you taking it forward from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, thankfully I have a great co-founding partner, Andrew Van Verst, who's the COO, does a lot of the regulatory side. He oversees operations and manufacturing and tackles some of the regulatory challenges. But we do have some regulatory challenges around our product in nature. Our products are considered what's called 361 tissue allografts. It's a subset of 1271 guidance from the FDA. Uniquely, it's kind of positioned as an organ or tissue transplant product, so it doesn't fit the mold of, say, 1271, 351, which would be your traditional BLA methodology or drug biologic pathway, or your standard NDA. New chemical entity drug, traditional drug pathway, right? So it's kind of this unique subset of regulatory pathway, which is challenging. Gets back to why are we doing clinical data and clinical trials? Because it's considered a tissue allograft, it has to be communicated as a cover or barrier because it has to meet what is called homologous use and to stay within that 361 framework. And so the FDA views placental-based tissue as considered a cover or barrier in the womb. So thus why we can't make any sort of claims around our product that it says it treats diabetic foot ulcers or treats venous leg ulcers. It has to be a cover or barrier. And so that becomes a little challenging, right? Like as you're trying to communicate the benefits and also talk about some of the clinical data that you have actually demonstrated with your randomized controlled trials, you still can't use language like it treats. You have to continue to kind of use that framework of the FDA and homologous use and minimal manipulation and things of that nature to communicate the benefits or the attributes of the product. So a little bit of a challenge there, especially on the commercial and marketing teams on how they position the product, but then also how we actually operate within our facility. So our facility is a AATB, or American Association Tissue Bank accredited facility, as well as inspected via the FDA's tissue group, which is 1271. We continue to get routinely inspections, and the manufacturing quality team has to adhere to what's called good tissue practices, or GTPs, versus what you would normally find in biologics as GMP, or good manufacturing processes. So a little bit of a difference there on regulatory is around manufacturing and FDA subsets of regulatory framework. So, but all in all, I think, at the end of the day, it's those are all good challenges to face, and hopefully as we kind of work towards demonstrating the clinical attributes of these products, we can start working and having more dialogue with the FDA of, is there a better framework to position these products? Should we be thinking about them becoming a device via 510K or PMA route? Or should we be thinking about some unique subset underneath BLA that doesn't require massive clinical trials to demonstrate the safety and toxicity, because these products are used every day, right, as a tissue product. So do they really need to go through that stringent piece of a BLA methodology, or can they have some other unique category that they can still then demonstrate the clinical aspects of them and make claims then, instead of not being kind of curbed to homologous use and as a cover or barrier?
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think in the pharma, biotech space, medical device space, we always run into the NDAs, BLAs, but this is so interesting to hear about a very unique space and the unique pathways and categorizations and terminology and all of that that go into developing a method like this. So interesting. And so the science, the regulatory side, and then, of course, the business side, the commercialization end of things when we talk about the whole life cycle of development of a method or product like this. And so what does that entail? And how do you balance the science with the business side of things in terms of the demands of running and scaling a biotech company?
Yeah, that's definitely the challenge part, right? It's you want to create really good science, but you also have to pay for that really good science, right? And you want to do all this great clinical evidence and demonstrate all this stuff, but you have to also balance the scale of, getting out there, commercializing the product to pay for those activities. So it's a good push and pull, as I mentioned, earlier about some of the regulatory challenges, right? We also, are challenged with some reimbursement new framework for reimbursement within CMS. Just recently, from a price cap for these products. We're also looking at potentially a local coverage determination, or LCD, which is kind of individual max coverage policy for these products near term. So continue to advocate for why we should be why CMS and why Medicare should be looking at utilizing these products to save limbs and save lives. And so that's a lot of forward education that from my seat, I've been really, pushing forward on. I think, wound care in general hasn't sadly had a lot of innovation in it over the years. Negative pressure may be kind of the most recent unique adoption of a new technology versus placental tissue or skin substitute based products. And so, we want to advocate and kind of continue to, as our organization, look to advance, different modalities for treating advanced chronic wounds, whether via be placental tissue based products or allograft products, but even maybe in the future of cellular based medicines and things of that nature.
And I think you touched on this, but how have you seen the field evolve, and with the growing adoption of these kinds of methodologies and these kinds of products in terms of, as you mentioned, perinatal tissue not as ubiquitous or not as universally known, adopted. And so the field has obviously come a long way over the past couple of decades. And so how have you seen things evolve? Where are they today? And how do you see things shifting potentially in the future in favor of the adoption of more novel or maybe not as well-known products, approaches, and methodologies?
It's an interesting question. I think in our field, we've seen a lot of evolution around reimbursement, the push from the current CMS and FDA to really demonstrate clinical evidence for these products. As I kind of mentioned earlier about the unique pathway that it sits, meaning 361, it doesn't have to go through those clinical trial gates, right, that you would normally see in a BLA. So there really wasn't a lot of folks focusing on demonstrating clinical evidence to get coverage and to get their product out into the marketplace. And so CMS really kind of pushed manufacturers and developers of these products to say, look, we want to see clinical evidence. We want to see why these products are the products that you are creating actually demonstrate clinical effect on the patient. And so, I really truly appreciate that. It allows us to actually to shine in the sense of buy or retain, because when we initially started this journey, we looked at how do we actually differentiate ourselves? How do we, in a field of, I'll call it, more commoditized products and manufacturing techniques, because it has to be minimally manipulated. How do we differentiate ourselves? And so we went out and got some IP around our processing. We looked at how to differentiate the product itself, and kind of yields itself to, okay, well, now if they're asking for what is the differentiation and how does it impact the patient, we actually have it, right? I think when we look at, what advice I would give entrepreneurs or scientists looking to get into this field, that's probably a 3-hour podcast that we don't have time for. We're on an 11-year journey, right? So there's a lot of trials and tribulations. I think one of the big things that I always tell folks, especially as we work with local universities like Florida Atlantic University and Nova Southeastern University, Miami University here in South Florida, is, really have good mindset of how to commercialize your product. Are there avenues in which you can get out there and there's a method or a way to commercialize your product and work backwards from there? Because everyone falls in love with their idea, right? Oh my God, I have the next biggest cure for cancer. Or I have the next biggest cure for disease state XYZ. But we forget to say, oh my God, this is going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars to get it through the clinical trial pathway. And then now we're left with, how are we going to, commercialize it and backfill and pay for all that research and development, right? And so by kind of starting more, I'll call it at the back end of the process, and look at, okay, is there a market? Is there a coverage policy that I know a similar like product has? And what is that covered? What does that payment rate look like? What does that coverage look like? And then work your way to the beginning, which is the development and the timeline and the R&D and all those things. It kind of sets you up for a little bit more, I'll call it, successful business plan, and frankly, easier way to pitch your idea to potential investors or stakeholders. So, I think that's where a lot of people kind of fall short, out of the starting blocks, is they get really excited and they fall in love with their product and kind of miss some of those bigger ticket items.
And in terms of upcoming milestones from BioStem, what can we expect, and what should our audiences and us here at Xtalks keep a watch out for in terms of things coming up in the next couple of months, the next couple of years, and potentially longer term plans as well for BioStem?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we are working towards building out our product portfolio, we want to have a continuum of care in which we service our patients. So not only having a product at the end of when a patient basically fails the 30 days of standard care, we're offering them a product like ours today, where we have products along the way. So we're treating the patient from day one to day closure. I think the second piece is really excited about the VLU study that we have coming up, right? We'll have some data. We'll finish enrolling patients here at the beginning of next year, and we'll have some data to talk about on the venous leg ulcer study. We'll have more data around, instead of just the top line results, we'll have some of the secondary endpoints and the full report of our DFU study in the beginning of next year as well. And we're going to continue to look at building and analyzing our real world data around pressure ulcers and potentially contemplate looking at initiating a clinical trial for pressure ulcers as well. So a lot of clinical trial development to look at hopefully expanding coverage for our products. We're looking to also expand our access for our products. As we announced even today, we got access to Medicaid in the state of Florida now. So continuing to expand our presence in the Medicaid channel. 13 states currently are cover our product for Medicaid. Medicaid's a state by state process, so you have to go through each individual state to get coverage. And so we're excited to continue to expand access there. And frankly, the biggest thing that I think we're really excited about is working towards expanding access into the VA and federal system to support our veterans and be able to offer them a product not only on the battlefield for acute wounds, but also in their homes as they are sadly in situations where they might have a chronic wound where we can hopefully save their limb to save their life.
I really love that. I love those perspectives rooted in the applications and in terms of who you can serve with something like this. And I love that you're thinking, BioStem's thinking about access, thinking about who the patients are. And I think, as you mentioned, veterans, I think sadly, they're often not top of mind at all, but for you to really have a focus and center them in something like this, I think that's very profound and very significant. Yeah.
As a wise man once said, don't fall in love with your product, fall in love with what your product does. And so, the value of being able to actually work with, donated human tissue from a successful birth and be able to take that gift of birth and maximize the value of that tissue and be able to deliver to a patient that maybe is sadly at the other end of the spectrum and hopefully improve their life so that they can get up on their feet and walk around or, be the first, attend their first dance to their daughter's wedding. Or, we have a list of stories of amazing folks that had a second chance or got an opportunity to save them from an amputation, where if they were to get an amputation, sadly, the statistics are pretty staggering. So.
And I think this also brings to mind, it really feels like you interact with patient communities, patients, and so patient advocacy groups as well. So I think a question that comes to mind also is when you're talking about this ecosystem of drug or device development, tissue development in this case, methods, who are the major stakeholders and players, and how important are those patient advocacy groups and patients, which I can tell are very important and top of mind from all of the details that you've told us about. But who are the important players in that kind of an ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a developing ecosystem. I think one of the challenges that wound care does have is that they don't have strong advocacy groups. When you look at ortho or you look at some of these other specialties, they have real strong advocacy groups. And sadly, I don't know if it's just because it's an infancy of wound care or just people haven't really, rallied around 2 or 3 main organizations to advocate on behalf of the provider or on behalf of the patient. I think that's sadly what we saw as coverage and payment methodologies changed over the last few years. Is there really hasn't been a strong voice the voice has been coming from manufacturers. It really hasn't been coming from providers or patients. And so one of the things that myself and one of our commercial partner leadership, John Schroeder at Venture Medical, is really trying to look at how do we stand up those organizations and stand up a voice for providers, stand up a voice for patients that, sadly in rural communities or underserved communities where they're really impacted by these types of wounds, there's nobody talking about it. There's nobody advocating for these patients. And, sadly, we're in a situation where, okay, well, it's a line item. It's a high expense to the government. Should we just look at cost savings versus, patient impact, right? And when you start really diving deep into, if we heal this wound today, we reduce the amount for infection, we reduce the amount of cost associated with amputation and all the underlying issues that sadly propagate from an amputation, right? And so I think one of our big goals, at least my personal big goal, is to really try to rally and develop a stronger voice for the patient and the provider and the advanced wound care community.
I think that is so significant in terms of some of the gaps that you just talked about in terms of the patient voices or the voices from advocacy groups not quite being there compared to other disease areas like rare diseases. There's so many very niche diseases that now have like very strong patient advocacy groups and organizations. And so that's very interesting. And thank you for shedding a light on that in terms of that being a profound and significant gap in wound care. And what other gaps do you see? And as we talk about unmet needs in wound care, which is very true, we don't hear a lot about it, but there's so many complications that, as you mentioned, arise from it, and from infections to amputations, and all of those translate into burdens on the healthcare system and end up really driving up costs at the end of the day. And so, apart from that, of course, patient impact, quality of life, and so many things at play. So what are some of the other gaps really in wound care, and what things need to be kind of done from your perspective that could help shine a greater light on this specific area?
No, it's also a really good question. We are faced with right now, when we talk about reimbursement reform, and we are faced with a new reimbursement methodology that sadly doesn't allow the economic profile for providers to go into a patient's home. So we came out of COVID, right? And we had the ability to utilize these products in a patient's home in a mobile wound care setting. Now, because of the uptick in utilization, CMS recognized, oh my gosh, we have a crazy uptick in utilization. We also have an uptick in spend. How do we cap this, or how do we mitigate this? The solution was to kind of flatline payment methodology, but sadly, we advocated for a higher reimbursement rate, but we weren't able to get that. And my concern based on that is the fact that the rate that they decided on will impact patients and providers' ability to get into those patients' homes. And those patients won't be seen because they don't have the means in which to get into a hospital outpatient center. They don't have the physical ability to get out of their home. A lot of these patients are in rural communities. So getting to a hospital outpatient center to get seen on a weekly basis there is no ability to do that, right? It's an hour drive each way. And okay, I'm just going to, not go in. And sadly, that's when things kind of snowball. And so I'm really concerned about patient access and frankly, providers that now just don't have the means in which to treat these patients, and how big of an impact that will have on seeing higher amputation rates, or frankly, patients just not getting good quality care. And maybe it's not amputations, but it's also infections and all the other underlying issues that happen when you're not treating these patients' wounds, right? Even some of the advocacy groups, like, it sounds kind of odd, but when you're an older patient, Medicare beneficiary, the odds of them looking at the bottom of their feet is rare, right? And so they have neuropathy. They can't feel those areas, right? And so having family members, hey, grandma or grandpa or dad or mom, lift up your feet. Let me see the bottom of your feet, because they just can't feel the fact that they might have a gaping wound. And so if you have providers going in the home and actually seeing those patients and actually looking and taking off their shoes and taking off their socks and looking at their feet, these patients get treated. And so I'm just really nervous about that. It makes me really concerned that the pendulum swung one way, but now it seems to swung way, way over to the other side. And there's not a good middle road for all those folks to receive therapy. So.
Wow, there's a lot at play there, indeed. Yeah. Thank you so much once again for shining a light on this very important area, which seems like there are, absolutely so many unmet needs, so many considerations. But thank you so much for the work you're leading to help fill some of those gaps, indeed. Thank you so much for the work that you do. And just want to thank you so much, Jason, once again, for your time, your insights, and above all, the very important work that you're leading at BioStem. And we wish you all the best. We're definitely going to keep an eye out for all of the developments and awesome work coming out of the companies. And thank you once again.
Thank you again for having me.
All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time. Bye for now.
Visit xtalks.com to join the life science community and unlock exclusive access to editorial content, webinars, networking opportunities, and more. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policies or positions of Honeycomb Worldwide. For more information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.